exclusive podcast here on the trackatnight.org. A day. As always, we continue to keep the podcasting moving along here at trackatnight.org, your one-stop shop for all the day's latest church apostasy and end-time news. Listen, we're podcasting Monday through Saturday, typically 3 to 4 guests a day. It's moving from one thing to the next. I just got my latest article up on the Order of the Eagle. Yes, in fact, this has always been sort of an intention of mine from the very beginning that we form a Catholic militia. And so I'm starting to work on the back end of that as well, given what we were seeing in the world, specifically happening here in the United States. But the breakdown of society is well underway. Now we have someone who comes onto the program every month to help break down his latest articles and get his analysis, Gerard El Kalman, who's a Catholic journalist, and he does such a fine job with his articles. We've got we're going to try to get through as many topics as we can with our good friend here, and I know he wants to talk about his latest articles, Argentinian deacon that we picked up. I think we started briefly discussing that last month. UN's normalization of child abduction. We want to talk the latest in the church and what it's seeing, race war, riots, geopolitics, and so much more. But before we hand it over to Gerard for opening comment, we've got to mention our sponsors here. Get over to jacksberry.com, a Catholic website and service dedicated to the teaching of the virtues of evangelization. With a strong devotion to the Immaculate Sacred Hearts, there are many saint quotes, prayers, articles posted throughout the week to help keep people on the straight and narrow. There's a prayer request, prayer intention section. Those get sent off to Father once a month, so please support John Dean's jacksberry.com. We also have the very popular traditional Catholic website, olrl.org. Joining us this month, Our Lady of the Rosary Library, which is a Catholic website that houses many saint quotes, articles. There's traditional catechism. There's an online store where you can purchase in bulk scapulars, rosaries, sacramentals. They have a homepage which updates monthly, folks, has important readings. Be sure to check those out. And you can also become a subscriber to their newsletter to get regular email updates. We also have Mike Berry, longtime follower of Track Cat Night, and his website, socialreignofchristtheking.com, and it's dedicated to the education and promotion of the only solution for the insanity which is enveloping the world, and that is, of course, promoting our king as such, as king, right? The social reign of our Lord. But then also I'm going to add the Immaculate Heart of Mary as well, which you know is so important for these times. And we also have to promote Kathleen Loney's 3 Days of Darkness kits, folks. You can find those on the 3 Days of Darkness page, the resource page up top at trackatnight.org. You can contact her. Find a kit for you and your family members to keep spiritually safe in these turbulent times. Prayers, sacramentals, herbs, and by the way, all these sacramentals are traditionally blessed by Father Foy. So email her today. She messages me from in the West. So please do message. Without any further ado, we bring onto the program our good friend. And buddy, where would you like to begin? Are we going to start with the Argentinian article? Would you like to begin there? Or where do you think?
Yeah, well, I mentioned it last month, Eric. Great to be back again. Yes, Jorge Sonnante, this deacon in Argentina, he's causing quite a stir in social media right across Latin America, and I've been following him now for over 6 months. I wrote an article then, and then I decided I'd wait a while just to follow his work a little bit more before I'd publish it. I published it and I took it down, and I wanted to get more kind of confirmation about his credentials, and found out a lot more about him since. And he is a deacon, a permanent deacon of the Catholic Church, who claims to have been an advisor of Pope Francis. He was interviewed in the media in Brazil, or rather Bolivia, by the current Minister of Communication, who is a former investigative journalist, Roxanne Ibazariga. Roxanne Lizarriga. And she had a radio show, a very popular radio show in Bolivia before she became Minister of Communication there. And she broke this story in Bolivia about bank accounts held by Latin American leaders, Los Santos of Colombia, Maduro of Venezuela, Lula da Silva of Brazil, Morales of Bolivia, and others. And it's quite an extensive list. And these claims were extraordinary. I mean, he produced the documents. She looked at and examined the documents. And then you had a response by Catholic media, which who denied it. You had spokesman for an organization run by Opus Dei said it was all a lie. This guy was not a deacon. Another bishop in Bolivia, in Sucre, whose name is Jesus. He's Bishop Jesus Sahara, I think. Suarez or Juarez, sorry. Juarez in Spanish, it's Juarez. Jesus Juarez, Monsignor Jesus Juarez, made an official statement to the media and said, this guy is not a deacon. We've checked it out, and this is all a fraud. This is a social media thing, and this guy was never a deacon. And he was interviewed again by this journalist I just mentioned, Roxanne, this journalist who's now the Minister of Communication in Bolivia. She interviewed him again, and she asked him, she said, look, are you, you've just come out in the media and you've contradicted me on this. So I've been investigating him. I've been exposing the story. I've gone to Argentina. I've interviewed him. I've done background checks on him. I've consulted financial experts to find out if these documents that he's releasing are authentic or not. And I've sent letters to the nunciate, papal nunciate, the apostolic nunciate, sorry, to find out if, you know, if this is true or not, if they would say anything to contradict it or make an official statement on behalf of the church. And I've got nothing. So you're saying this is untrue. So are you speaking on behalf of the apostolic nunciate and the Holy See? And he said no. So she said, so you're basically, this is your opinion that this guy is not a deacon? He said yes. So he basically admitted that he didn't really have much evidence against him, and that, you know, the church, the official authority of the church, which is the apostolic nunciate, should make an official statement on this to clarify the matter. Now, this is kind of spread throughout Latin America, and I've been watching it in different countries. He was interviewed as well in Colombian media by the former Justice Minister and Minister of the Interior there, who also said, you know, the claims were quite extraordinary, very serious, a massive crisis, a massive scandal, if true, and that it should be investigated. So I've given a kind of detailed description of this deacon. I do believe he's a deacon. I'm not sure. I cannot say if he's telling the truth or not, because the Vatican is so complex. This is to do with Pope Francis's links to the left in Latin America. I do know that this deacon worked with a guy called Momo Venegas, who was a former syndicalist leader in Argentina who was close to the Pope. And I know for a fact that he was close to the Pope. And I've spoken with his daughter, who's currently in hiding because she's being pursued by various people in Argentina due to a conflict that she had with the succession of her father's estate. Her father's estate, basically, she didn't get her father's inheritance, and there was corruption and all kinds of things going on. But the long and short of it is that she's now in hiding. She has spoken in the Latin American media, but incognito. She's quite... So the daughter of Momo Venegas, that is to say, one of the best friends of Pope Francis, contacted me to confirm his identity, and I'm pretty sure it was, you know, this is the daughter of one of the Pope's best friends, Momo Venegas. Also, you know, this deacon has been quoted in the Italian media, the mainstream Italian media. Libero in Milan have referred to him in their investigations into pedophilia in the church as one of the deacons investigating that. And also Russia Today in 2019 quoted him, a tweet from him, as a permanent deacon of the Catholic Church. So he has already been sort of quoted here and there in the mainstream media for a couple of years as a permanent deacon of the Catholic Church. And so I'm pretty confident that he is a deacon. And I think that the only debunking of his work has been that he's not a deacon. And I think that's a real question. Now, he claims to have been ordained as a deacon by Cardinal Burke, and I think, you know, Cardinal Burke hasn't said anything on this, and I think he should. If you know, if you wanted to, if this is false, he should come out and debunk it. I think, because this is something that could cause a major problem the investigations, I think, into pedophilia, particularly the exposure of Pope Francis by Vigano. So this is something I've basically tried to bring to light in the English-speaking world. There's a lot of translation here of a lot of work, a lot of documentation, and I've been trying to kind of expose this story and basically to suggest to Catholic media that they deploy their resources and investigate this. I think it's an important story. It's important if it's true, and it's also important if it's false, because if it's false, I do think this is an intelligence operative, and it might explain some of the intrigue that's going on in Latin America. Remember, I just referred to an article from Russia Today in 2019 where another deacon was murdered in Argentina, and this guy, Jorge Sonnante, was quoted commenting on that murder, and he claimed that this was a warning against him. So he has claimed that, to have received many death threats and so on. So I cannot say for sure if what he's saying is true, but I do think this story is important because it's very much linked to a lot of what's going on in Latin America in terms of the scandals in the church, but also the political turmoil there. And I think it's an important story. I think mainstream Catholic media, I'm surprised that they haven't picked up on it and debunked it by now. And I'm surprised also that the Catholic Church hasn't come out and made an official statement, at least. So that's that story. And I think it's something that should be looked into.
Good stuff, buddy. Good work there. Now, in conjunction with the message of Fatima, wherein Sister Lucy said the final war being waged by Satan would be on the family, we got to pick up on that notion and transfer it over to the UN. Apparently, the UN is rolling out the normalization of child abduction. I think you just wrote a piece on that. I just went through your Twitter feed, by the way, and retweeted a bunch of stuff. So hopefully that'll keep information moving. But let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, well, I wrote an article with the title, is the UN preparing children for abduction? And if you read the article, it's about a book called My Hero, which was written by a group of people working for a UN agency. And the book is being promoted by the French government for schools, for national schools here, and it's supposed to be promoted throughout the world. I haven't checked all the countries and all the different websites of different countries, but the education department in France is promoting it as the kind of book that should be taught to children in school to explain coronavirus. Now, the story is basically about a little child who's alone in his bed at nighttime, and hears a voice, and it's a dragon, and the dragon basically says, come along and I'll show you, don't be afraid, I'm a friendly dragon, and basically takes him on a kind of a trip where he goes into the desert, and it's full of pyramids, and I don't know why they chose pyramids in the desert, but I'm sure you can imagine why, coming from the UN. And he basically sees these sick children. He goes to a camp. I don't know why he goes to a camp with children either. It's a very weird story. And, he sees these sick children, and it's sort of saying to him, don't worry. You may need to be separated from your parents for a while, but, we'll take care of you. And anytime anytime you're fearful, just call on me, the friendly dragon, and this will be our little secret. So this is a sick story. I mean, this is not what you would teach to children to give them any kind of social hope or to give them any kind of assurance. You teach your kids that your parents love you and they'll always take care of you and they'll always be there no matter what. And you don't need to worry about anything because we've got everything under control. That's what you tell your children, in my view. You do not tell them, you may need to be separated from your parents. So I've just argued that, in Christian culture, the dragon is the symbol of is the devil, and has always symbolized the devil, and it's not surprising given the history of the UN, given the fact that one of the major spiritual centers of the UN and a huge influence on many of the founding fathers and chief ideologues of the UN over the years has been the Lucis Trust, which was originally called the Lucifer Publishing Agency. I think it was changed to the Lucis Trust, which is an openly Luciferian organization. And I made the point that whether you're religious or not, if you're a secularist or an atheist and you're sending your child to a public school, you're sending your child to the public school on the assumption that it doesn't have a religion, that it sort of has a neutral view to religion. And so that the idea of most secularists is that the state is neutral, and so that it doesn't kind of matter what religion you are, and therefore religion is a private affair. But what most parents don't realize is that the institutions now that are setting the agendas in the world do have a religion, and it's openly Luciferian. I don't see how you can be a materialist and have this be so-called scientific and materialist and so on, and be a part of a theosophical organization. Why would you want to do that? Even if you thought that Christianity was all mythology and it was all fairy tales, it's very beautiful mythology. It's a very beautiful story, and it's much nicer to the idea of loving your neighbor and so on is much nicer than the idea of Lucifer, in my view. So again, people are going to these secular schools. They think they're secular, but if you look behind if you look at the agenda more closely, you see that they're deeply religious. It's just that it's not your religion. It's just not the religion of the people. And the French government have put out kind of guidelines for the how to sort of cope with children after the crisis when they get back in school and what they should be looking out for. And again, those guidelines, in my view, are deeply, deeply worrying, because they're talking about, any children who, any children who seem to be under the influence of religious parents should be looked at closely. Are the parents talking about the apocalypse? Are they talking about coronavirus being a punishment from God and so on? And again, the idea of coronavirus being a punishment from God is a mainstream Catholic view. I mean, most genuine Catholics see this as a punishment from God. That's simply a mainstream Christian view. So they're basically threatening to send social services to the school to secure in inverted commas the child who might be under this kind of influence. And so I think that they're normalizing the whole idea now that part of the new norm is kind of finding out what the opinions of the parents of the children are and whether they're Christian or not. And of course, that will be a problem for the UN and for the coming global regime. So in that article, I just sort of talked about kind of counter view of the world that you could present to children in coping with this virus, which is Saint Michael, the slayer of the dragon. And I mentioned the 7 great monasteries in Europe, from Skellig Michael in Ireland to Mont Saint Michel in France, going right down to Israel, to Haifa in Israel. You probably know this story, I'm sure, and your listeners would. The 7 great monasteries in Europe that form the shape of a sword, the sword of Saint Michael, and that they're all linked up pretty much in a perpendicular line. And just kind of talk about that story as a the kind of story I would tell a child would be that story of how Christendom was built, defeating the dragon and defending the family and defending truth. And so that article then kind of goes into a more disturbing aspect of the current EU in general, but in France in particular, and the fact that most of the main oligarchs behind Macron are convicted pedophiles. His actual boss ran an orphanage, was involved in running an orphanage where children were abused and trafficked. He was described by the media here as the boss of President Macron, convicted for drug pushing, was involved in a major pedophile scandal, did time for it, and is still the advisor in the Macron campaign, one of the top men behind the French president. And I listed a whole load of other people, like the former Minister for Culture in France, who openly boasted in a book he wrote about going to Thailand, raping young boys. And I've been covering this for quite a while. You see quite a lot of these people, and they're pretty much all in the highest echelons of power. And so when you kind of consider that this is the kind of, these are the people who get to the highest level of the so-called secularist state, you realize that there is a danger now with this new norm, this new regime they're bringing in, where essentially if you look at the schools, what they're trying to do in the schools, it's absolutely horrific. I mean, they've turned schools into concentration camps. In France, they had I have never seen anything like it. I mean, I couldn't sleep after seeing some of these images. They had tape around children, and they would punish any child who stepped outside the square. I can't imagine any regime in history. I mean, we can mention all the cliches, the Nazis and so on. I don't recall ever seeing anything as tyrannical as that. Because when you start messing with children, scaring the hell out of them, it's just, for me, it's unspeakable what they're doing.
Yeah.
And I think the agenda here, when you look at the media, I've just tweeted out from the French media, now there's a barrage, of course, of, tweets about the family and, conjugal violence and, husbands who beat their wives and husbands who kill their wives. And of course, it's partly true. I'm sure there's been a spike in conjugal violence, but, who locked up the whole country for months, and like how many men lost their jobs, how many, and of course the idea here, I think, is just to demonize the natural family, because I don't see anything about gay couples killing each other, or I don't see anything about, it's all about the natural family. And so there is a concerted campaign now in the media to publish articles about, the crimes and the evils of the natural family. So this is, in my view, all part of an agenda to destroy the family and to separate parents from their children.
Yeah, good stuff, buddy. Great work there. What about geopolitically speaking? Breaking down India, China, how does U.S. fit into the equation? I've been covering some of the latest there. It's been going back and forth between Russia and the United States. A couple bombers a few days ago were intercepted. I can't recall where. It wasn't over. I'm sure you heard that one. Russia now talking about their hypersonic missiles again. It's in Catholic prophecy where Russia, with their advanced weaponry, if you will, or secret weapons, attacks the United States, overruns Europe. And again, I don't know what's going to be the Kickstarter to that, whether it's the Ukraine border, U.S., NATO. Is it going to be Syria? What do you think?
Well, I've been saying for a while, if you look at, geopolitically, there seems to be two blocks emerging. And one is that, and I've, again, in my coverage of Latin America, I've kind of shown that the populist right in Latin America has, a lot of good things about it, and in sort of defending all the, family, and Bolsonaro is defending a lot of good causes, yet he sort of seems to be in bed with the Zionists and, and perhaps Masonry as well. Trump has done, I think, amazing things, but then you have to look at sort of things like, who is Donald Trump? What exactly does he represent? And you could kind of talk about Jared Kushner and his relationship with Israel. But nonetheless, I think if you look at discursively right now, Donald Trump is taking the direction, at least in the direction of Christianity. I would say that the march on the church, St. John's Church, even praying before or John Paul II, revisionist or whatever, Vatican II Pope or whatever, nonetheless, I think it's highly symbolic. And I think that Qurano-skepticism is sort of coming more from the United States than from Russia. If you look at Russia, and if you look at the Russian ideologues, people like Alexander Dugin, and I've met him, he's a very interesting analyst. Nonetheless, they're very much pushing the sort of idea that coronavirus skepticism is rubbish and there is no real problem. And it seems to me that if you look at geopolitically what's happening in Europe, there is a move now to sort of join up with Russia, and I've seen this happening for quite a while. Even President Macron were kind of talking about the turn to the east, and China is very much in control of Europe. I mean, they've kind of bought us out. And I think they'll profit massively from this crisis. Perhaps come in and buy everything that's left anyway. And so I see the formation of a sort of Eurasian Union happening more and more, where the European peninsula gets kind of swallowed up by the Eurasian landmass. And so I've mentioned this before, Astana as a kind of an administrative capital, a new kind of Brussels, if you like, of a Eurasian Union. it seems to me that it's designed to be that way. Jerusalem being the capital of the world regime, the kind of spiritual capital of the world regime, but sort of a kind of Eurasian formation happening where the EU basically, it's just such a decadent place now. We don't even know what gender is anymore in Europe. Whereas if you look at Russia and China, they have at least still some of the basic things correct. They don't have the gender wars there. So they're militarily much stronger, I think. And they're probably more capable of logical thinking. And so they could easily swallow up the European peninsula, which is so decadent now, it couldn't possibly defend itself. So I see a conflict happening long term here between, if you like, the United States, which will probably re-establish the Monroe Doctrine in South America if it continues with populist regimes there, versus Eurasia. It's kind of like Orwell's scenario of Oceania constantly being at war with Eurasia, and so that that could be kind of the emerging world regime that you would have. It just looks that it looks like now that Europe is going to disintegrate further and further, and that you could see again, militarily, Russia is the only kind of the only real power in along with China in the Eurasian landmass. So a war between these two blocks in the long term is possible in my view. What do you think?
I don't know, buddy. There's so many different variables. It's almost like every day, like some kind of new piece of information comes out, and then you're like, man, you start twisting your own kind of thesis or analysis. So I just know that we've got to be getting closer and closer to something on the outside of what's been happening here in the United States. Which, by the way, I want to get your take on the whole riots, race war. I mean, I've been warning about the race war here now for quite some time. But yeah, I mean, I definitely think we have to keep our eye on Russia. I'm more inclined to think, pay attention to that Ukraine area, United States, NATO, kind of overstepping their boundaries, because that's what Father Malachi Martin said shortly before his death. But then how China fits in, I mean, I don't know. I know Father Kramer has come out and talked about how eventually Russia and China, or China will turn on Russia, then Russia will have to defend against China. Seemingly allies at this point, but I don't know. It's just so much geopolitically.
I think that the Russians and Chinese, there is always that possibility because of China's need for Lebensraum. They need more land, basically. And Russia, if you look at East Siberia, it's very underpopulated, underdeveloped. And Russia has been very strong geopolitically, but very poor geoeconomically. It's still only, I think, the fifth power in the world. It's about the same level of economic power as Spain. It's not a major economic player, whereas China is increasingly playing that role, and as it increasingly plays that role of the world superpower, economic superpower, I think it will assert itself more and more with Russia, and of course you see China and India are increasingly at loggerheads, with India very much backing up U.S. claims that the coronavirus might be a kind of a Chinese laboratory experiment gone wrong, and or at least mismanagement, and so on and so forth. I think it's much more likely that I think if the Trump administration is sincere in its plans, I think that what they really mean is that it's by targeting China, it's a sort of a safe way of saying the globalists, because China is very much in bed with the globalists now. It's going along with climate change, it's going along with the green agenda. It hasn't signed up to a lot of other globalist agendas like gender destruction and things like that yet, but it is going along with sort of world government more. China has had no real problems with the World Health Organization, so we see that as a rupture happening there between the US and China in terms of globalist institutions, and I think that that's a very, very interesting development. India, of course, is having further border issues with China and being backed by the US. But I think it was very interesting that the US had to import hydroxychloroquine from India, and then started threatening India when they were hesitating. And that's kind of an interesting. I think ultimately each country is going to have to go back to self-sufficient production. This is the only positive thing that could come from this. That a new consensus around self-sufficient production would emerge. But because we are China is just overwhelmingly dominating the world now. And people talk about, I've defended China in the past because there are conspiracies against China too, but it's too easy to blame them. I do think, however, that the global government system they're trying to build is the Chinese model, because it is, if you look at the social credit system in China, it is kind of hell on earth. Mm-hmm. And I think they would love to bring that in the EU in particular. I don't think it would work in America, because I think that you're still protected by, the invocation of God in your Constitution in the United States. At least in the United States, you can still say that you have God-given rights and you have the right to bear arms. And as I mentioned that before, we have nothing like that in Europe. We have a European Constitution which was made by elites against the people's wishes. We voted against it. They made us vote again, and they imposed it. And it's a complete dictatorship that we're living under. So I see far less hope for Europe, particularly the European Peninsula, than the United States right now. Just another topic there that I've written on before I go, which is kind of another thing I've been kind of covering for quite a while, which is neocolonialism, European and US neocolonialism in Africa. And as we're on the topic of racism in America, I think this kind of feeds back into that, which is the African countries and some of their responses to the COVID-19 crisis. Like, there have been a few interesting cases of the World Health Organization being expelled from African countries. Burundi, for example, which is a Great Lakes country near Rwanda in Central Africa, they expelled the World Health Organization for interfering with their management of the crisis. Now, the official position of the Burundian government was that this is, nothing to be worried about. Continue working, take some measures, whatever, but don't really worry about it. And it hasn't been a problem. The country hasn't really been affected by it. So because of the World Health Organization were interfering, they kicked them out. And I made a point in my recent article about this, that the country's leader, former leader, he was just ousted and replaced by an ally of his. The country's former leader, Pierre Nkurunziza, he's very Christian. He's an evangelical Christian, but very fervent Christian, who has, in my view, and I've been following him for quite a while, done quite an extraordinary job in stabilizing a country that came out of a major genocide going back 20 years ago or more. And, built up the country. And in 2016, I wrote an article with the title in Global Research. It was, "Is the US and EU destabilizing, or are the US and EU destabilizing Burundi?" In that article, "Are the US and the EU sponsoring terrorism in Burundi?" was the title. I explained how there was basically a low-intensity war was being launched in Burundi from about 2016 against the Nkurunziza government there, to oust him, basically. And there's a whole plan of destabilizing not just that country, but many more in Africa. And of course, the media never cover it. The liberal, leftist, anti-racist, in inverted commas, media never, ever talk about these things. So this is an example, I think, of a country with, that is invoking God, basically. Evariste Ndayishimiye, the new leader of the country, said, "Look, we don't fear COVID-19. God will protect us, and we're just going to continue working." And this is kind of spirit, I think, that's prevailing in that country. And I made that point. Another country I mentioned is Tanzania, where President John Magufuli, who's another Christian, as you know, the former president there, Julius Nyerere, I think is supposed to be canonized, or is a candidate, I think, for canonization. The president of Tanzania, John Magufuli, you probably saw that, where he made a speech saying that they tested for coronavirus in Tanzania, and basically it turned out that everything had coronavirus. Car oil tested positive for COVID-19. Right, yeah. Goats tested positive.
Did you see George Floyd was found to have coronavirus? The black guy.
I was going to say that. I'm sure the memes are going around about that. But so the president of Tanzania that was quite an amazing speech, and he said, look, he said to the people of Tanzania, go back to work, pray to God, and everything will be fine, and just go and do your work, and just ignore. He said that there's corruption behind this, and I thought it was highly significant as well. And then the third example, and the final example, I'm just going to talk about is President Rajoelina of Madagascar. You probably saw that story as well, where he basically they came up with what they call a remedy for coronavirus, a herbal remedy, which apparently works. I mean, or is at least effective, and in any case, it's a pretty natural concoction that they came up with there. And he made the point that this again, they were being attacked by the World Health Organization. They were being discredited by the media. And yet this was, the result of African research, African scientists, local products, local expertise, and so on. And this total idea that African country cannot possibly make its own decisions. It has to be told by, Western liberals what to do and what to believe. And there is a big rebellion happening in the African continent against this kind of domineering attitude of the West. And the same people who love to talk about racism all the time never ever support these countries, never ever talk about it, never mention it. And these are the first people who will go on and preach about racism and so on. And yet they've never ever stood up for developing countries who've tried to defend their national sovereignty and their right to decide their own affairs. And so I think it's important. I mentioned in that article about how AIDS was manufactured essentially to discredit, to divert from the activities of the homosexual community in America, which caused the outbreak in the first place, and to sort of displace it onto an African problem, or to sort of suggest that this was an African problem. And I described that whole process about how, Professor Duisberg in the United States, who basically had diagnosed this early on, had studied it, had shown that it was essentially to do with that it was a disease prevalent in the homosexual community in the United States that was linked to their use of poppers and their unsavory lifestyle, their unhealthy lifestyle, and that this was essentially what it was, and the HIV thing was basically a hoax, which there's no scientific proof for, and that was confirmed by Stefan Lanke in Germany. Now, the reason I mention that is because that became a huge industry which pretty much targeted Africa more than any continent. I mean, it became pretty much the African disease. Instead of the gay disease, it became the African disease. And it led to, massive amount of racism, real racism, nasty kind of stuff against Black people coming to Europe, because they were, people would say, oh, they're all HIV positive and they're all, and, liberals never mentioned that. They never mentioned the fact that, when the only African leader who invited Duisberg to get a second view on the crisis was Thabo Mbeki, president of South Africa. And he invited him along with other scientists, to South Africa, basically to get another view, because they were making no progress. In fact, people were getting more and more ill as they were being treated. And of course, the reason why they were getting sicker is because it was the antiretroviral drugs which were causing the sickness, which is what Duisberg was saying and other scientists were saying all along. And again, when that happened, liberal leftists attacked Thabo Mbeki, attacked the South Africans for daring to make up their own mind about how they would deal with a crisis in their own country. And that's just very indicative of the liberal left mindset, which is totally colonialist. It's mindset far closer to the Ku Klux Klan than anything else. And I've been saying this for years, and I see this the way in which the race riots are being covered in America. How these privileged, spoiled brat white kids handing out bricks to Black people, trying to get them to use them as a battering ram against Trump is it's disgusting,
Yeah, it's an interesting time, buddy. Well, we're glad that we have you to break down a lot of these topics again. Before we let you go, why don't we get through some shameless self-promotion time? So lay the website on us again, lay some social media on us.
So it's GOC News, and you probably get to it easier if you type GOC News Garode, Gearoid. So GOC News Garode, Gearoid. GOC News Garode.
Good stuff, buddy. We appreciate your time, folks. Thank you all for tuning in to Trad Cat Night special guest exclusive podcast for this June the 4th, 2020. Until next time, stay safe and God bless.